The 16th of March 1945 at 0600 hours, the operations room at 3rd Army Headquarters was already crowded, not with urgency, but with friction. Maps lay spread across tables, in overlapping layers, road nets, fuel overlays, bridge classifications, each one slightly out of date. Staff officers moved carefully between them, careful not to disturb the pins marking the previous night's gains. The advances had come faster than expected, and speed itself was beginning to generate problems. Reports from the 12th Corps showed armored columns 30 kilometers ahead of schedule, but fuel consumption tables had not been recalculated to match the pace. Momentum was no longer a byproduct of success. It had become a variable that strained the system holding it together. At 0635, a logistics briefing interrupted the morning rhythm. The 3rd Army G4 reported that fuel convoys allocated for the day were still staged east of the Moselle, delayed by damaged bridges and traffic congestion. From follow-on units, under standard planning assumptions, this would not have mattered. The advance was never meant to run this far ahead of its supply tail, but those assumptions no longer matched reality. The operations officer noted the discrepancy in the logbook, without comment. Everyone in the room understood the implication. Either the pace slowed, or the risk increased. No formal order was issued to resolve the contradiction. By 0715, communications from the 15th Corps added pressure. Reconnaissance elements reported minimal resistance along secondary routes toward the Rhine. With German units disengaging or bypassed entirely, the Corps' commander requested authorization to continue exploitation beyond the day's planned limit line. The request was precise, framed in doctrinal language, but its meaning was unmistakable permission to outrun the plan. The message sat on the duty officer's desk while staff weighed the consequences. Advancing faster promised operational advantage. It also threatened to unravel coordination across the Army front. At 0800, the weather briefing arrived late. Low cloud cover and intermittent snowfall persisted, limiting air reconnaissance and close air support. Normally, this would have counseled caution. Instead, it removed one of the constraints that slowed German reaction, further tempting ground commanders to push forward. The intelligence officer noted that enemy air activity remained negligible, suggesting disorganization rather than deception. The room absorbed the report in silence. The absence of resistance was itself destabilizing. There was no clear point at which momentum should be checked. By 0830, tempers began to show. A senior logistics officer challenged the assumptions behind the morning's exploitation requests, arguing that fuel reserves were being consumed faster than projected and that bridge repair units were already overcommitted. His concern was met with restrained irritation. The operations staff pointed to the map. Every mile gained now reduced the enemy's ability to regroup. Delay, they argued, was the greater risk. The disagreement remained unresolved, logged as a coordination issue rather than elevated to command decision. Momentum continued by default. At 0915, a radio message from one of the armored divisions introduced a new complication. The division reported crossing a river line earlier than expected, using an intact bridge, not marked as load-bearing for heavy armor. The crossing succeeded, but the engineers warned the structure might not survive repeated use. The report forced a recalculation of risk. Supply convoys might not follow, leaving forward units dependent on limited on-board fuel and ammunition. The information reached headquarters with a reliability rating of confirmed, but no immediate corrective order followed. The advance had already moved past the decision point. By 1000, the map no longer reflected intent, it reflected momentum. Corps boundaries blurred as units advanced at uneven rates. Staff officers began annotating margins with pencil notes. Position approximate, contact uncertain, resistance light. These were not signs of confusion, but of acceleration, beyond control. The plan, once a sequence of phases, had become a trailing document, revised after events rather than guiding them. At 10:45, the army commander entered the room. He did not raise his voice, but his presence shifted the atmosphere. He asked a single question: how far ahead were the lead elements relative to supply? The answer was evasive, framed in averages rather than specifics. He listened without interruption, then directed that exploitation continue where resistance was light, but that no unit was to halt solely for resupply unless combat forced it. The order was deliberately ambiguous, neither a break nor a full release. it transferred responsibility downward, where consequences would be borne. By 11:30, reports from the right flank indicated that neighboring formations were struggling to keep pace. Coordination meetings scheduled for midday were postponed as commanders focused on maintaining contact. Liaison officers noted growing gaps between advancing columns and slower infantry units. The gaps were not yet dangerous, but they represented a fracture in sync. The staff acknowledged the risk, but no one proposed slowing the advance to restore alignment. Momentum, once achieved, exerted its own authority. At 1200, a fuel status update confirmed the emerging constraint. Several armored battalions reported reserves below 40%, with resupply estimated no earlier than evening. The figures were written on the situation board in chalk, erased, and rewritten as new estimates arrived. Each update lagged reality by at least an hour. The operations officer noted that if resistance stiffened unexpectedly, forward units would lack the endurance to respond. The comment drew nods, not action. By 13:15, intelligence intercepts suggested German command was attempting to reconstitute defensive lines farther east, relying on the assumption that the Allied advance would pause to consolidate. This assumption, once predictable, was now questionable. The intelligence chief warned that speed itself was shaping enemy decisions, forcing them into premature commitments. The assessment strengthened the argument for continued pressure. Again, the trade-off was clear. Speed promised strategic payoff, but magnified logistical fragility. At 1400, an argument broke out over a single road junction. Two corps claimed responsibility for its security, each assuming the other would hold it. The dispute delayed engineer traffic and forced a reroute of ammunition convoys. The incident was minor in isolation, but symptomatic. Authority was diffusing. Under the strain of rapid movement, decisions once centralized were being improvised at lower levels, not out of defiance, but necessity. By 1500, the first tangible cost appeared. A forward armored task force reported halting for lack of fuel, exposed on a ridgeline without infantry support. Enemy contact remained light, but the pause created vulnerability. The report carried a note of frustration rather than alarm. Headquarters acknowledged receipt and advised the unit to maintain position pending resupply. The phrase concealed the reality. Momentum had outrun the means to sustain it. At 16:15, the operations room grew quieter. Radios crackled intermittently as staff waited for updates that did not arrive on schedule. The chalkboard showed advances impressive in scale, but uneven in depth. The army commander reviewed the situation again, this time with visible concern. He approved a limited reallocation of fuel priority to forward armored units, diverting supplies from rear echelons. The decision was irreversible in its effect. Some formations would slow so others could continue. Momentum was being concentrated, not moderated. By 1730, the consequences of that choice began to register. Units stripped of fuel priority reported delayed movement and increased congestion. The supply network, already stretched, now operated under treat. Staff officers annotated the logs with conditional language, temporary, exceptional, as if the strain might pass on its own. No one believed it would. At 1845, evening reports confirmed that the day's gains exceeded expectations, but cohesion had suffered. Several units were ahead of adjacent formations by more than 20 kilometers. Communications gaps widened as radio nets reached their effective limits. The enemy, though still disorganized, was no longer static. Small, delaying actions appeared along roads once assumed open. Each required time and fuel to resolve. By 2000, the final briefing of the day confronted the central dilemma without resolving it. Victory was no longer measured solely by territory seized, but by whether the pace could be sustained without collapse. The plan, once a framework for control, had become a reference point left behind by events. Commanders recognized that momentum, once unleashed, could not easily be recalled. To slow deliberately risked surrendering initiative. To continue blindly risked fragmentation. The night closed with orders to press on where possible and consolidate. Where necessary, a contradiction recorded without comment. Behind the language lay the truth that the war had shifted from execution of design to management of acceleration. No one in the room believed the enemy would recover the initiative. Fewer believed the system could continue at this speed indefinitely. The contest was no longer simply against the opposing army, but against time, distance, and the limits of command itself. the 17th of March, 1945, at 0430 hours. Third Army Headquarters was already awake, though few had slept. Lamps burned low over maps smudged, with pencil corrections made through the night. Radios crackled intermittently, their operators exhausted, hands stained with grease and ink. The tempo of the previous day had not slowed. It had accelerated.
Beyond formal control, what unsettled the staff was not enemy action, but the realization that the Army was now moving faster than the framework designed to govern it. Patton arrived early, coat unbuttoned despite the cold. He did not wait for a formal briefing. He walked directly to the main situation map and traced the previous day's advances with his finger, stopping at points where corps boundaries overlapped or dissolved entirely. The picture was untidy, units staggered forward at different depths, supply lines stretched thin, reserves undefined. To most commanders, it would have signaled the need to pause. To Patton, it confirmed opportunity. At 0510, the G3 presented a cautious assessment. Fuel stocks forward of the SAR were critically low. Several armored battalions reported less than 1 day's operational reserve. Infantry divisions lagged behind the armored spearheads by up to 30 kilometers. Doctrine dictated consolidation, rebalancing, synchronization. Patton listened without interruption, then asked a single question. Where was the enemy strongest? The answer, uncertain, scattered, disengaging, ended the discussion. By 0535, verbal guidance moved down the chain before formal orders were typed. Corps commanders were instructed to continue exploitation wherever resistance remained weak, regardless of phase lines or scheduled pauses. The wording was deliberately imprecise. It left room for initiative and for disobedience cloaked as interpretation. Staff officers exchanged glances but recorded the guidance as received. No one challenged it openly. Patton's authority was not procedural, it was kinetic. At 0615, the first friction appeared. A division commander requested clarification regarding fuel thresholds. His tanks could advance another 20 kilometers or hold position and guarantee resupply. Patton's response, relayed through operations staff, was blunt: advance until contact or empty. The message carried no nuance. It redefined acceptable risk. Fuel, once a limiting factor, became a wager placed against enemy collapse. By 0700, reports confirmed that several subordinate commanders were already bending orders. Some rerouted supply convoys without authorization. Others committed reconnaissance units as assault elements to maintain pace. These actions violated doctrine but preserved momentum. Staff officers noted the deviations in logs marked non-standard, a bureaucratic label that concealed the reality. Control was slipping by design. At 0745, intelligence updates reinforced Patton's instincts. Intercepts suggested German formations attempting to re-establish defensive coherence east of the Rhine, assuming Allied forces would pause to regroup. That pause did not come. Instead, armored columns pressed through gaps, bypassing towns and leaving isolated pockets to be reduced later. Speed disrupted enemy planning faster than artillery ever could. By 8:30, exhaustion surfaced as a constraint Patton chose to ignore. Infantry units reported men marching for 36 hours with minimal rest. Vehicle crews slept in shifts measured in minutes. Medical officers warned of declining effectiveness. These reports reached headquarters, were acknowledged, and then set aside. Patton's calculus was ruthless. Fatigue could be recovered. Opportunity could not. At 0915, a Corps operations officer raised concern about command cohesion. Orders were being interpreted loosely, sometimes ignored entirely, as subordinate leaders prioritized movement over alignment. Patton did not deny it. He accepted it as the cost of speed. His view was clear. Doctrine was written for conditions of parity, not collapse. The enemy was not dictating tempo. Therefore, the rules no longer applied. By 10:30, the supply system showed signs of strain approaching failure. Fuel convoys became targets of opportunity rather than scheduled movements, diverted on the fly to units most likely to break through. Ammunition deliveries lagged, forcing commanders to ration fire in favor of movement. The staff attempted to impose order through revised priorities, but decisions were overtaken by events before ink dried. At 11:15, a divisional commander reported bypassing an enemy strongpoint without engagement to maintain pace. The move exposed his flank, but preserved momentum toward a key road junction. Doctrine would have condemned the decision. Patton praised it. The endorsement traveled quickly through the army, reinforcing a dangerous lesson. Audacity would be rewarded, caution penalized. By 12:30, the map at headquarters bore little resemblance to the plan issued 48 hours earlier. Phase lines were crossed without notice. Timetables were irrelevant. Staff officers updated positions continuously, aware that each update lagged reality. The army was no longer executing a plan. It was improvising forward. At 13:45, fuel shortages finally imposed consequence. A mechanized task force stalled on a secondary road, engines silent, exposed. Enemy contact remained minimal, but the vulnerability was real. Patton was informed. He ordered the nearest mobile reserve, already short of fuel itself, to divert and assist. The decision compounded risk, but preserved pressure. One formation's endurance was sacrificed to keep another moving. By 1500, German resistance began to stiffen in isolated nodes. Small blocking forces appeared at road junctions, forcing brief engagements. Each engagement consumed time and fuel, threatening the fragile balance. Patton responded by ordering bypass wherever possible. Containment would come later. The instruction further eroded centralized control, placing moral and tactical burden on subordinate commanders forced to decide who was left behind. At 16:30, tempers flared within headquarters. Logistics officers argued that the army was approaching a breaking point. Operations staff countered that stopping now would forfeit the advantage already gained. Patton ended the debate abruptly. He reminded the room that wars were not won by caution after success, but by pressing success until the enemy could no longer respond. The room fell silent. Obedience followed. By 1800, reports from forward units confirmed the effect. German formations were retreating faster than anticipated, abandoning equipment and cohesion. Bridges were seized intact. Roads once contested were open. The enemy's assumptions were unraveling under pressure. Patton's gamble was working, not cleanly, not safely, but decisively. At 1930, night operations orders were issued that defied convention. Units were instructed to continue movement after dark, accepting increased risk of disorganization. Navigation errors multiplied, vehicles broke down, yet the advance did not stop. Speed itself became a weapon, denying the enemy the time required to think, plan, and resist. By 2130, the cost became visible. Stragglers increased, communications failed intermittently as units outran relay stations. Some commanders operated for hours without contact from higher headquarters, acting on intent alone. This autonomy was dangerous, but it sustained momentum. Authority had become distributed, not by reform, but by necessity. At 2300, Patton reviewed the situation one last time. The map showed chaos, but also progress on a scale that doctrine could not explain. He issued no new orders, only reaffirmed the existing guidance: keep moving. The decision locked in the course. There would be no pause to restore order. The army would either reach its objective or fracture along the way. The night closed with engines running low, men barely standing, and an enemy increasingly unable to respond coherently. Patton had broken the rules of supply, of rest, of control, and forced his army beyond its design limits. The risk was immense. The margin for error was gone. But momentum, once seized, was carrying them forward faster than any plan ever could. 18th of March, 1945. At 06:10 hours, British Army headquarters received the first consolidated situation summary from the northern sectors. The tone was factual, restrained, and increasingly defensive. American armored columns were advancing faster than projected, bypassing expected pause lines and forcing continuous recalculation of shared operational boundaries. What unsettled British staff was not the advance itself, but the asymmetry of tempo. One partner was accelerating, the other was still synchronizing. Inside the operations room, maps were rotated to reflect the new reality. Pins marking British corps positions appeared static by comparison. The contrast was uncomfortable. Months of deliberate planning, logistical harmonization, artillery preparation, phased movement now resembled hesitation under the glare of American momentum. Officers spoke quietly, careful not to frame concern as criticism, but the implication hung heavily in the room. By 0700, the first supply friction reports arrived. British transport units, already stretched by winter roads and rail congestion, struggled to keep pace with the shifting front. Fuel allocations had been calculated against a slower, coordinated advance. Patton's surge disrupted that rhythm. Supply officers noted that shared depots were being drained faster than replenishment schedules allowed, forcing uncomfortable prioritization decisions. At 0745, liaison officers reported growing strain at the seams of coordination. American units were crossing into zones still nominally under British operational responsibility, often without prior notice. These movements were not hostile, but they were unilateral. British corps commanders faced a dilemma: assert procedural boundaries and risk slowing the advance, or adapt silently and absorb the disruption. Most chose the latter, though not without resentment. By 0830, a senior British staff officer articulated what others hesitated to voice. Careful planning, once the alliance's strength, now risked appearing as caution bordering on irrelevance. The enemy was collapsing faster than expected. Speed, not synchronization, was defining success. Yet abandoning methodical control threatened chaos, both operationally and politically. At 0915, reports from forward British units confirmed the cost. Some formations found themselves advancing into areas already bypassed by American armor, their objectives rendered obsolete overnight. Others encountered gaps where expected American support had surged ahead. The battlefield geometry no longer matched the shared plan. Adaptation became reactive rather than deliberate. At 1000, political pressure began to surface indirectly. Messages from London emphasized the importance of maintaining alliance cohesion while noting public perception of momentum. Headlines followed miles gained, not logistics preserved. British commanders understood the subtext. Falling visibly behind carried consequences beyond the battlefield. Credibility, influence, and post-war standing were at stake. At 1045, a tense exchange occurred during a joint briefing. An American liaison officer spoke confidently about continued exploitation eastward, assuming British formations would adjust accordingly. A British general responded with measured concern about supply integrity and flank security. The exchange ended politely, but the divergence was clear. One side measured risk in opportunity lost, the other in systems strained beyond recovery. By 1130, fuel shortages forced British units to slow further. Convoys queued along frozen roads, delayed by traffic and damaged infrastructure. Requests for priority allocation competed with American demands justified by forward progress. Staff officers documented each delay meticulously, aware that explanations would be required later, if not now. At 1215, the operational imbalance began to erode morale. British officers trained to value control and coordination found themselves reacting to decisions made elsewhere. The sense of command autonomy diminished. Orders felt increasingly derivative, shaped by events already unfolding rather than choices still available. Quiet frustration replaced overt dissent. By 1300, the alliance machinery strained audibly. Communication lines buzzed with clarifications, boundary adjustments, and reconciliations of mismatched reports. Each correction arrived late. Each update acknowledged a reality already superseded. The friction was not failure, but it was cumulative. At 1345, a senior British commander privately questioned whether restraint was still defensible. He understood the logic of speed, yet feared the long-term cost of disorder. The dilemma was moral as much as operational. Preserve discipline and risk irrelevance, or gamble cohesion for pace dictated by another's audacity. By 1500, German resistance in British sectors had thinned but not collapsed. Without the overwhelming shock of rapid penetration, engagements remained methodical, costly in time. Comparisons were unavoidable. American breakthroughs dominated reports. British advances were measured, professional, and increasingly overshadowed. At 16:30, headquarters issued revised guidance emphasizing flexibility and cooperation, carefully worded to avoid confrontation. The directive acknowledged accelerated conditions without endorsing abandonment of doctrine. It satisfied no one fully. The gap between principle and practice widened. At 7:30 p.m., fatigue deepened. Staff officers rotated off duty briefly, returning to rooms unchanged by rest. Maps bore layers of erasure. The operational picture grew harder to explain, even to those shaping it. British leadership remained composed, but the confidence of alignment was gone. At 8:30 p.m., another joint update arrived, confirming American forces had seized additional crossings, further redefining the front. British formations adjusted again, always one step behind a moving reference point. The imbalance was now structural. By 8:30 p.m., the realization settled across headquarters. Leadership was no longer speaking with one voice because it was no longer moving at one speed. The alliance endured, but equilibrium had shifted. Influence followed momentum, and momentum now belonged elsewhere. The day closed without rupture, but with an unspoken recalibration. Britain had not failed. It had been overtaken by events, and by a partner willing to accept risks it could not. The cost of that divergence would unfold later. For now, the advance continued, uneven, unbalanced, and irrevocably altered. 19th March, 1945. At 08:20 hours, the first consolidated briefing reached the Prime Minister's office. It arrived not as a celebration, but as a ledger. Locations taken, crossings secured, timetables erased. The tone of the report was restrained, deliberately technical, stripped of flourish. The Rhine had been crossed faster than anticipated. The advance was irreversible. The cost, still incomplete. Churchill read the summary in silence. He did not interrupt. He did not dictate an immediate response. The margins of the document filled with his pencil marks, questions rather than exclamations. How far forward were the spearheads? What reserves remained uncommitted? Which boundaries had dissolved and which merely shifted? The victory was undeniable. So was the disruption it implied. By 0900, his military secretary noted the absence of instruction. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and ink. Outside, the city moved as it always did under wartime routine. Inside, Churchill weighed the distinction between outcome and control. He had seen brilliance before, often followed by overreach. The report described speed. It did not describe sustainability. At 09:35, the chiefs of staff transmitted their preliminary assessment. American forces had achieved decisive momentum. German command cohesion was fracturing. Opportunities for exploitation were real. But the message also carried cautions: extended supply lines, exposed flanks, coordination lagging behind movement. The words were careful, chosen to temper enthusiasm without dampening resolve. Churchill acknowledged receipt. He asked for nothing further. The restraint unsettled some in the room. They expected rhetoric, approval, defiance, reassurance. Instead, they received contemplation. The Prime Minister understood that praise once spoken became endorsement not just of result, but of method, and the method unsettled him. At 09:45, a draft communiqué lay on the desk. It congratulated Allied forces on a significant achievement and praised American leadership for its determination. Churchill revised it personally. Adjectives were trimmed, references to daring were softened. The final language emphasized cooperation and shared purpose. The victory belonged to the alliance, not to speed alone. By 1100, discussions turned inward. Senior advisors debated whether Patton's approach represented a necessary adaptation or a dangerous precedent. One argued that audacity had shortened the war. Another warned that audacity once rewarded became expectation. Churchill listened without intervening, absorbing the tension between admiration and caution.